Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Ordnance Hill in St John's Wood, NW8. 3 streets west of the first failed assassination by Carlos the Jackal. 2 streets north of the first possible victim of the Blackout Ripper. And 4 streets east of the seedy sex scandal of lusty Lord Lambton. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Ordnance Hill is a middle-class street full of 4-storey Georgian terraces. With many split into flats, it seems odd that anyone would move into a basement flat, as their only view must surely be feet. But maybe that's the selling point. Basement flats are a foot fetishist's must, where they go crazy for cankles, flip out over foot cheese, go fwar over corn plasters, and get a major boner for bunions. Everyone has obsessive tendencies, and for many it's nothing but a bit of harmless fun. But for one man, his obsession for a woman he claimed he no longer loved would lead to murder. On the 26th of December 1994, at 1 p.m, the body of 27-year-old Dr Joan Francisco was found in a basement flat at 13 Ordnance Hill, with the prime suspect being her ex-boyfriend, who had a history of stalking her. His conviction should have been imminent. Only this isn't just a story about obsession. This is the tale of a family's 5-year battle for justice, with the evidence having been missed owing to a fatal mistake. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 258, 3 Tiny Specks. Joan was an exceptional woman. Born on the 27th of January 1967 in Westminster, West London, Joan Sarah Francisco was one of 3 sisters to their father Alfred and their mother Venus. With her parents having come from the sun-kissed Caribbean island of St Lucia in the 1960s to the endless drizzle of London, having dedicated their lives to giving their children the opportunities denied to them, all 3 of their girls flourished and succeeded. Blessed with brains, a convent education, and their parents' hard-working ethic, both of Joan's sisters, Marguerite and Celia, eventually sought out the bright lights of Los Angeles, where they practiced law. Whereas, like her mother, a former nurse, Joan was drawn to the benevolent profession of medicine. Described as bubbly and eternally likeable, Joan trained at the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead, where she often worked as a locum. Specialising in gynecology and obstetrics, she also trained at the famous Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in LA. And having obtained her doctorate, by 1994, Dr Joan Francisco was working at the Queen Charlotte Hospital in Hammersmith, and with her said to be at the top of her profession, she had planned to move to the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. Working 100 hours a week, although her career was hectic, she excelled in every field. But like most people, her love life was sometimes a little bit rocky. In 1987, while 20-year-old Joan was a medical student, she fell in love with 27-year-old Anthony Gilroy Diedrich. Born in Paddington, Tony was doing a degree in computing at the University of Westminster. He came across well, being clean-cut and driven, But what too often shone through was his arrogance. In total, they dated for about a year, and although Joan was initially lured by his looks and his charm, as a bright woman who didn't suffer fools gladly, it was the support of her family which helped her to make the right decision. Sometimes, all it takes is for a loved one to be brutally honest. And when her sister Celia met Tony, with amazing foresight, she forewarned Joan that her boyfriend was a ticking time bomb. As an inveterate philanderer who always cheated on her, and whose aggressive streak had resulted in him pushing her off her bike and smashing a light bulb which injured her eye. By the winter of 1988 to 89, Joan ended the relationship, with Tony defensively claiming, "I wasn't that keen on her." But Tony wasn't the kind of person who took rejection well. As with his fragile ego bruised, although anyone with a modicum of self-respect would have shrugged off this snub and moved on. Across the next few months, as Joan made it abundantly clear that the relationship was over, he refused to accept it. In February 1989, Joan complained to the police that he was harassing and stalking her. As a wastrel who drifted between aimless jobs, he followed her from the hospital by Wormwood Scrubs prison to her parents' home at the Ridgeway in Acton. But with this being 8 years before harassment was made an offence, and almost 30 years before stalking was criminalised, there was little the police could do. Growing ever more distracted at his persistent pestering, everything came to a head that month when seeing Joan with her new boyfriend at her family's home. Boiling with petty rage that the woman he claimed not to love was seeing someone else, he smashed a plate glass window on the patio door and threatened to kill her new boyfriend. With Tony admitting guilt to criminal damage, Justice Hallett, who presided over the latter trial, said, "It's not surprising. She wanted nothing to do with you." And although the only punishment he received was a police caution, this brief dalliance with the legal system made him open his eyes to the truth. Across the next 5 years, they didn't see or speak to one another, and this lack of contact helped their lives to flourish. Joan qualified as a gynecologist, and having graduated as a computer programmer, Tony went on to have many other unhappy girlfriends, and over time, he forgot about Joan. The two had moved on to greener and brighter pastures. But all it took was a glimpse of Joan for his warped obsession to re-emerge. Being born, raised and educated within streets of one another, a brief interaction by chance was bound to happen. But whereas Joan only harboured feelings of revulsion and fear, for Tony, he wasn't filled with a need to seek her forgiveness for his actions. He wanted to possess her. In February 1994, neighbours spotted him hanging around her parents' house in Acton, spying through the window. And as a truly sad and pathetic man with nothing better to do, again he followed her. Knowing that any contact would give him hope that their relationship may be rekindled, Joan had considered taking out an injunction against him. But again, she hoped that by ignoring him, he would eventually get bored and leave. Only the more she ignored him, the more obsessive he became.
This is the 9 o'clock news.
By the autumn of 1994, his obsession was consuming his life. In his flat on Fermoy Road, Police would later find a homemade listening device so he could eavesdrop on her telephone conversations, a body heat detector so he could tell if she was in the house even if her curtains were shut. And not only had he listened into her bedroom at night, he had also spied on her as she got undressed. By the end of October 1994, Joan left her parents' home in Acton and moved into her own basement flat on the quiet leafy street at 13 Ordnance Hill in St John's Wood. Desperate to keep herself safe, she made her home phone number ex-directory, and she only shared her address with a chosen few. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find her. But his twisted persistence knew no bounds. Calling every hospital and discovering that she was working at the Royal Free in Belsize Park. On one occasion, he called the switchboard 10 times to find out if she was on shift. In conversations with friends, he denied being obsessed with her, even though she was the only thing ever on his mind. And he resorted to sending letters to her mother to find out where she lived, but no one would speak. He was obsessed, not with Joan, but by the fact that he couldn't possess her and control her. And as this object of desire vanished into thin air, far from his grasp, the more this made him need to seek her. At the trial, he would claim, "I had no meaningful contact with her since we stopped dating." Only somehow, he had found out where she was living, and soon she would be dead. By the November of 1994, Joan was staying with film producer Anthony Henry in Bolton, having met him on a flight back from Los Angeles. And across that month, she worked as a locum in Southport. Tony knew she wasn't in her basement flat at 13 Ordnance Hill, as from the corner of Acacia Road and St John's Wood Terrace, he spent many evenings and nights watching her unlit, unoccupied home for signs of life. Knowing almost nothing about her new friends, her career, her plans and her boyfriends drove him wild. And whether someone let slip, or he scrabbled for scraps of details by going through her bins, it's uncertain how he knew that Joan was leaving for Los Angeles on the Boxing Day of 1994. But he did. Before the start of the next part of her career at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, Joan had planned to take a month-long break to see her sisters in California. But as Tony's paranoid brain leaped to the illogical conclusion that she was leaving Britain, although she had only just moved into that flat, he believed that he had to act now, or he would lose her forever. Sunday the 25th of December 1994 was a typically cold and wet Christmas day. As planned, Joan spent it at her parents' house in Acton. They shared presents. As a gifted pianist, she entertained them with a rendition of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And being fun and calm, there were no dramas. Joan chatted on the phone to her sister Marguerite, who said, "See you tomorrow." Only tragically, tomorrow never came. Having kissed her mother goodbye, Joan headed back to the basement flat on Ordnance Hill. With her flight to LA leaving the next day at 2 p.m, having pre-arranged to see her parents at 10 a.m, she had a lot to get done that night. so dressed in her knickers and a red t-shirt emblazoned with the words Beverly Hills, California, she finished packing, and planning to be away for a month, she cleaned the flat. That night, being full of festive cheer, Joan's only distraction was the weather. As with the rain soaking the street and the dark clouds hanging low, the gales were looming, which risked a delay to her flight. Inside her flat, lost in her own thoughts, Joan vacuumed the flat, unaware that, through the window, someone was watching. Monday the 26th of December 1994, Boxing Day. Not a flake of snow had settled, but as a sodden gloom hung over the city, thankfully the predicted 70-mile-an-hour winds had missed West London, and with only minor delays at Heathrow Airport, none of the planes to LA had been cancelled, including Joan's. Her mother realized that something was wrong when she failed to arrive at her home as planned. And then, when her home phone just rang and rang and rang. At 1 p.m, growing concerned, the police broke in via the locked front door. And at the foot of the stairs, her body was found. When questioned, not a single neighbour heard a sound as their new resident was murdered, as few knew her name or the circumstances which had plagued her for the last few months. With the front door locked from the inside and the back door left open, Detective Superintendent Philip Bebb initially believed that it may have been a burglary which had gone wrong. But what baffled him was that no cupboards were opened, no drawers had been ransacked, nothing had been taken, and although Joan was only dressed in knickers and a red t-shirt, there was no evidence of sexual assault. Somehow, her killer had got in, and with footprints across the back garden, implying that was how he had fled. It was likely that Joan had opened the front door to him, suggesting that maybe she knew him. At some point, the two had had a confrontation. At some point, a violent struggle had ensued. At some point, knowing they were never to be, he had pummeled her face with his fists, as if to say, "If I can't have you, then no other man can." And in an ultimate act of possession, at some point, wrapping the vacuum cleaner cord around her neck, he choked the very last breath out of her lungs and ended her life. With no fingerprints found at the crime scene and no witnesses to the incident, the police were at a loss. 8 years earlier, DNA fingerprinting had been successfully used to solve a crime. So although it was still in its infancy, Joan's knickers and t-shirt was sent to the forensic expert, Dr. Ann Preston, for analysis. Being fresh on, the t-shirt was clean. Several sections were tested, but they only matched Joan's DNA. And with 3 tiny specks of blood on the inside, believed to have dripped from a wound to her mouth. Even the latest innovations in forensic science couldn't find a trace of the man who had murdered her. Or it would have done, if a crucial assumption hadn't been made. Joan's family believed there was only one suspect, Tony Diedrich, Joan's ex-boyfriend and a stalker. A few days after her murder, he was arrested and questioned at length. He denied knowing where she lived, but the police knew that he was lying. He gave an alibi as to where he was that night, but the police had 19 witnesses who saw him loitering outside of her flat. And although his statement was littered with lies, the evidence against him was so circumstantial that no one saw him knock, no one saw him enter, and with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no DNA, they couldn't prove that he'd been in the flat. 10 months later, after an exhaustive investigation and endless false leads and dead ends, the inquest declared that Joan had been unlawfully killed. But the coroner, Dr. Paul Knapman, stressed that more evidence was crucial in order to catch the killer, and if found, it's likely a person could be charged. Everyone associated with the case knew that Anthony Diedrich was the culprit, from the police to the family to the coroner. But the definitive proof was missing. After the inquest, even Detective Inspector Michael Bennett said, "Everyone on the inquiry is 100% certain they know who the killer is." But with no new evidence, the investigation stalled. And yet still, her loved ones fought on. As a close-knit family, still grieving from the loss and seething that the only suspect was living his life and walking around having literally got away with murder, Joan's sister Marguerite would state, "The police are supposed to bring criminals to justice, and nothing was happening. But justice had to take place, so it meant I had to do something. That was the scariest part. At some point I realized that something had to be done. And as a lawyer, I was the only one who could do it. I couldn't depend on the police." Seeing a program on the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence in Plumstead, Marguerite called Karen Thatcher, one of the lawyers in the case, and in March 1998, they took the evidence to a civil trial. Unlike in a criminal trial, the standard of proof at a civil trial is lower. Therefore, it didn't require any new evidence to be presented. Across a 2-week hearing in March 1998, this was an unprecedented case which, for the first time, someone was to be sued for a murder they hadn't been charged with. Forced to relive the trauma, seeing the crime scene photos containing her daughter's strangled body, Venus said, "She must have called out for me, and I wasn't there to help. She was lying on the floor with that vacuum cleaner cord around her neck. She must have been pleading and crying out." Not being legally bound to attend the hearing, the accused, Tony Diedrich, gave no evidence. At which the judge said, "I find it incredible that he did not seize the opportunity to declare his innocence." And although maybe it was his arrogance which compelled him not to, that was also part of his undoing and the beginning of the end. On the 24th of March 1998, Joan's family made legal history when they successfully sued her alleged killer. Awarded £50,000 in damages, plus £17,000 in funeral costs, the money wasn't the victory, but the fact that, after the Crown Prosecution Service had refused to prosecute him owing to insufficient evidence, a High Court judge was satisfied on the balance of probabilities that Diedrich had stalked and harassed her, that he had no alibi for the day of the murder, that he was watching her that night, and believing she was about to set off for America, he entered her home, struck and strangled her. The judge decreed, "I consider those factors make it a very strong prima facie case. This is a dreadful judgment to have to pass on any man. But I find the assault and battery alleged, in effect the murder, to have been proved." Anthony Diedrich had been successfully sued in a court of law for damages. They had won the civil case. But the criminal case would be a very different matter. In a criminal trial, you have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not based on the balance of probability. So having re-examined the evidence put forward at the civil trial, on the 16th of May 1998, the Crown Prosecution Service said that, as no new evidence was forthcoming, the original decision not to prosecute stands. Rightly, Joan's mother was furious, stating, "I can't find the words to express my anger and dissatisfaction. I am utterly disgusted and disappointed with the CPS for thinking so little of the life of a human being. We will fight on until Joan's killer has been put behind bars and justice is seen to have been done." That month, with the Met Police being embroiled in a racism row over Stephen Lawrence's murder, the family met Met Police Commissioner Sir Paul Condon, and he ordered a fresh investigation into her murder. And 4 years on, with new advances in DNA testing, that the evidence should be re-examined. We submitted to the forensic expert Dr. Ann Preston for analysis. That same red t-shirt, emblazoned with the words Beverly Hills, California, was tested. But this time, a crucial piece of information was given. At the time of the murder, Joan was wearing the t-shirt inside out. Therefore, the 3 tiny, almost pinprick-sized specks of blood which were found on the inside and were mistakenly believed to have dripped from her bleeding mouth were actually on the outside of the t-shirt. Using a more advanced DNA test, which hadn't been available in 1994, the blood around the neck was proven to be Joan's. But the 3 tiny specks of blood had belonged to her killer. Arrested on the 15th of January 1999, blood samples were taken and Tony Diedrich was proven to be her murderer. When asked if he hadn't seen her since 1989, and her t-shirt had been washed hundreds of times in the 6 years since, asked to explain how her t-shirt contained traces of his blood on the day that she was murdered, he simply said, "I don't know." In a 3-week trial held at the Old Bailey, Tony Diedrich pleaded not guilty to murder. With both the defense and prosecution in agreement that the 3 tiny specks of blood on her shirt was his, there was only a 1 in 170 million chance that the DNA wasn't his. But still he tried to plead his innocence, denying that he was obsessed with her, which made Joan's family worry that, still with no proof that he'd actually been in her flat, that he could still be acquitted, and again, he could walk free. With the jury deliberating for 4 hours, on the 12th of October 1999, A cry rang out across courtroom 2 when the verdict was read.
On the charge of murder, how do you find the accused? Guilty.
After almost 5 years, with a coroner's inquest, a civil trial, CPS battles, a failed investigation, and a forensic test which had been fatally flawed, Joan's family had done the unthinkable and had successfully brought her loved one's killer to justice, when everything else had failed and everyone else had given up. Anthony Dietrich was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years before parole was considered, during which, as an arrogant man, he interrupted the judge's sentencing and accused Joan's family of lying. He was due for release in 2014. Summing up, Mr. Justice Hallett said,
You claim to have loved her. I'm not convinced that you know the meaning of the word. You were obsessed with her, but you could not have her. You stalked her in a mean and despicable way, knowing that if she knew what you were up to, she would be terrified.
Of Joan's family, the judge praised their dignity and determination, and feeling that they could finally put Joan to rest. In her honor, they set up a foundation in Joan's memory to train black doctors.